Alrighty, so the book that I read for this week is White Flight, Atlanta and the Making of Modern Conservatism by Kevin M. Kruse. And just a little bit of background on Kevin Kruse is that he is a professor of history at Princeton University. This book is the first book that he published in 2007, and it's based off of his PhD dissertation. And his background is mostly in the 20th century U.S. history, focused on race and racism, as well as post-war suburbia and other topics, mostly centered around political, social, and urban history. So the initial narrative of White Flight, the old narrative, is that it was just a simple movement of white families that moved from urban centers into suburbia. And Kevin Kruse is looking to challenge this old narrative. So he argues that white flight was not just a single change that occurred, but it had lasting changes and impacts towards the development of politics. And so he focuses, as the title suggests, he focuses this narrative in Atlanta, because Atlanta at the time of the 60s and 70s thought of itself as a city too busy to hate, despite the open racism and the impacts of white flight. And so Kruse instead argues that Atlanta is more of the city too busy moving to hate. So it's mostly just this movement. It was a very drastic movement from the city to suburbia by white families. Excuse me. So yeah, this book seeks to challenge the old narrative of white flight and look at it from a different perspective and its lasting impacts. So the book is told chronologically, beginning before World War II, and looks at the post-war era and through the Civil Rights Movement, and like I said before, the impacts of white flight that preceded the Civil Rights Movement. So it summarizes the results of white flight from desegregation of city buses and schools, as well as to how white populations sought to try and maintain their power. And according to Kruse, this power struggle resulted in bringing conservative politics into the mainstream and legitimizing white resistance. So in the early chapters of this book, looking at before World War II, he talks about how different white supremacist groups such as the KKK looked to revamp their image as opposed to this violent group, as a group that is looking at more of protecting white power and protecting the power that white families had. So it was also seen as different white politicians were protecting white neighborhoods, as well as who holds power in public spaces, especially as desegregation is being enforced by higher powers of the government. So through this movement of white flight from urban centers in Atlanta to the suburbs resulted in a solidification of the political culture of the right in Atlanta. And Kruse argues that this solidification started out as a grassroots movement of white resistance, but eventually moved into the mainstream and solidified this conservatism as more white families just moved away from urban centers instead of previous attempts to resist African Americans expanding into their space, in quotes. So so it's just kind of looking at, instead of white families actively and oftentimes violently trying to maintain their power, these families are just simply moving away from the urban centers into suburbia. So he talks a lot about the use of public space and desegregation, which I thought was really interesting and really cool. So for example, and just kind of as white resistance is moving away from a very strong open presence into more of a more subtle approaches. So for example, hold on, I'm going to read a brief little quote of a poem that was tacked on in 1959. This poem was tacked onto a bulletin board at the police headquarters in Atlanta. And you can see, if you can kind of hear a little similarities of the poem that's here as one that is pretty well known. So, look at my children and you shall see the plan of improvement by William B. On a great civic virtue we're about to embark, and we'll start this one off at Old Mosley Park. White folks won't mind losing homes they hold dear if it doesn't take place on election year. Before they have time to get over the shock, we'll have the whole section every square block. And the poem continues, but I'm just going to read that a little bit. So this poem definitely speaks of the rising white resentment and backlash into Atlanta's neighborhoods, and especially starting around chapter 4 is where Cruz really starts to get into how white backlash began to rise in Atlanta in response to desegregation. And he also talks about how desegregation and public space, how it differs between classes, actually. So there are the poor whites that saw like different public spaces such as buses as theirs, and then upper and middle class whites saw like pools and golf courses as their own public space. And so as desegregation became enforced, they saw this as an infringement on their public space. And this is also where chapter 4 is where Cruz starts to get into how this political resistance began to rise, especially through a tax revolt, which is where white Atlantans felt that they were paying more in the way of taxes that paid for these public spaces that African Americans were beginning to use. And so Cruz definitely argues that as white Americans saw that the public space was theirs because they paid taxes for it, and they saw that their property was being taken away. So some of the strengths and weaknesses of the book. In the name of weaknesses, this book starts off kind of confusingly in a way. For some reason, it's really difficult for me to comprehend like the structure and the language that was going on in the introduction in chapter 1, which I thought was really interesting. Because then after that, especially around chapter 4, it all made sense, and but I had to keep going back and rereading the introduction in chapter 1 for some reason. So that might have just been me. And the use of like political terms, and also like vocabulary that had to deal with urban planning was a little bit difficult for me to understand because I just don't really know a whole lot about the different terms used in urban planning. So I feel like you could have explained it a little bit better. And again, I felt that a lot of the argument wasn't really his argument was addressed a lot more in the later chapters, like starting around chapter 4, as opposed to before. And the previous chapters, the introduction through 3, were really good at providing a really strong background, but it wasn't until like chapter 4 where I really started to see a lot of the influence of the politics in these changes. And so I felt that it should have come a little bit earlier. Some of the strengths of the book, the fact that it is organized chronologically, I think is a pretty good way of organizing the book. And I also really liked his analysis of public space, but I also find just public space in general to be really interesting and fascinating because even though it's supposed to be like an equal and nobody's supposed to own this like public space like parks and things like that, there still is a visible you can still see these like separations and distinctions between groups looking at different public spaces. And it begs up like questions such as who owns public space and who dominates them. And I also liked how he talked about the differences between the North and South of the U.S. when it came to desegregation, because I think a lot of times some books don't really touch on the North at all, but he spoke about how the northern United States did not feel a lot of the direct impacts of court-ordered desegregation until the 1970s, whereas the South felt it a lot sooner, which resulted in a stronger backlash. And I also think that this book could definitely be used as an inspiration for challenging narratives in other areas of history that had to do with the civil rights movement, because Cruz lays it out that he's like, I'm challenging the narrative of white flight in this book. And that's kind of what my group is planning on doing for our group project, is challenging the narrative of MLK. So I thought that this was a good book for that. And it also makes me wonder of how could we look at white flight in the context of other cities other than Atlanta, because Atlanta was not the only place in the United States that experienced white flight. So kind of wonder, and just restructuring of neighborhoods in general, I wonder how this kind of argument could be presented in other areas. Any questions?
Questions for our presenter? So do you think that the author effectively makes their argument about a new narrative white flight?
Yeah.
Convincing.
Mm-hmm.
Give us some details that really convinced you.
Some of the details that convinced me was definitely the use of public space, and then the tax result that followed this narrative, because that was where, or at least kind of how he explains it, is that this is kind of when white Atlantans began to sort of violently like reject desegregation, and he talks about the arming of bus drivers and how a lot of those conflicts ended in violence, and how sometimes, and so you're arming bus drivers, but this is supposed to be a public space. And then as they progress throughout the book, then it's like, oh, we're just going to move. So.
Other questions? Who do you think this book is best read by? General audience, specific audience, undergrads, advanced college students?
I think that this book would definitely work in a what do you call it? An educational setting. I think that it can be a good way to kind of, like how he wants to challenge the narrative. I think that that can definitely be utilized in different classroom settings of like this concept of white flight is so much bigger than just people moving. So I think that that could definitely be really helpful. It's like difficult to say though if like a general audience would react well to this. Maybe it's just because I found like the first chapter to be just really confusing in the way that he laid it out, and I read it like 3 times. I still feel like I didn't quite understand what was going on.
Is it just the vocabulary?
Yeah, I don't really know, because then the rest of the book flowed really smoothly, so maybe I just kept reading it on the wrong days. I was just really confused on what was going on.
You usually want to trust those kind of reactions.
Yeah. So, but I think it could definitely work in a like an educational set or like an institutional setting. Yes.
I'm just kind of curious if there were any specific stereotypes of white flight that he targeted. So you described it as just people moving, but I guess like a little more specificity on it, maybe.
That's kind of what I was getting, is that it was mostly just the moving, yeah, and focusing mostly after like the desegregation of public schools and stuff.
So in your opinion, how important is the phenomenon of white flight in the big picture in establishing race relations in this country? Is this a minor story? Is this a major story? Is this the story?
I think it's a major story. I mean, it happened everywhere. It's not like it just I mean, even my family in Seattle was a part of white flight. It's not necessarily something that I'm proud of, but it happened everywhere. So I feel like it's definitely important for people to read it and understand that it does fit in a bigger picture of race relations and solidifying like these different like barriers between people.
Other questions for our presenter? Okay, thank you, presenter.